Good evening and welcome. I'm Rebecca Carter-Chan, Director of the Programs on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for this program called Reconsidering the Catholic Church and the Holocaust digital event. Tonight's discussion is an exciting and timely opportunity to highlight Holy Silence, a thought-provoking new documentary that examines the role of the Vatican and US leaders in shaping the Church's response to the rising Nazi threat and anti-Semitism spreading across Europe. The USHMM remains closed as much of the country and the world due to the coronavirus pandemic. We're grateful for your patience if we experience any technical issues tonight. Our moderator this evening is Dr. Kate Timoney, Assistant Professor of Religion at Montclair State University and a Genocide Studies scholar. Welcome, Kate. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good evening, all, and thank you for joining us. As Rebecca shared, my name is Kate Timoney, and I will be moderating tonight's panel. And I would like to remind our audience that during tonight's show, you can send your questions through the chat to our co-host, Julia Ledeen, and then we'll get to as many of those questions as possible. So before we begin our discussion, I would like to share that the timing of this documentary, Holy Silence, is quite fortuitous. As Rebecca shared earlier, this documentary examines individuals who played a crucial role in shaping the Vatican's response to the rising Nazi threat across Europe. And on March 2nd, 2020, the Vatican Archives for the period of 1939 to 1958 opened, which included the time period that's covered in the film, only to close due to the COVID-19 outbreak on March 6th. They reopened to researchers in early June with COVID-19 based limitations. And then these limitations have meant that many in the international research community still haven't been able to access or travel to Rome. So we're quite fortunate to have the opportunity to discuss issues related to the Vatican Archives this evening. And now I would like to introduce our panelists. So first is Dr. Suzanne Brown-Fleming, Director of International Academic Programs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Adam Gregerman, Associate Professor of Theology and Associate Director of Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, and a member of the museum's Committee on Ethics, Religion, and the Holocaust. Dr. Philip Cunningham, Professor of Theology and Director of Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at St. Joseph University in Philadelphia, and Stephen Pressman, Director and Producer of Holy Science, and the Emmy-nominated 50 Children, the Rescue Mission of Mr. and Mrs. Krause. Thank you. Welcome to all of our panelists. I would first like to start with a question to the director of our film, Steve. So let's start by diving deeper into the timeliness of this afternoon's, or should I say this evening's conversation, depending on where you are in your time zone. We noted at the start of the program that the Vatican's wartime archives were open last year. But they haven't been able to because of the pandemic. So how did and how does this affect your film? What is the significance for choosing the title Holy Silence, very provocative title? And then what outcomes or conversations did you hope your film would elicit? And then how do you see the success of the film so far?
Wow, those are four great questions. I'll try to take all of the hour to answer all of them. I'll be fairly brief, Kate, and thank you. And I'm honored to be part of this very distinguished panel as the only non-doctor on the panel. You know, Kate, when I started making the film a few years earlier, I knew in the back of my head that Pope Francis, as my other panelists know, that Pope Francis had been long considering opening up the long secret archives pertaining to the papacy of Pius XII. So in the back of my mind, I always knew that, to be honest, there was a little bit of a risk involved in making a film about this period of history, knowing that at any moment those archives might have been opened. And in fact, about a little less than a year before the film was actually completed, I was just beginning to work with my film editor to put the sort of finishing touches on the film. This was actually several months before the film was completed. And I woke up that morning. This was in March of 2019. I woke up that morning to the news that Pope Francis had announced that a year later, in March of 2020, those archives were going to be opened. And I have to admit, Kate, that I went into a little bit of a panic that day because, of course, I had spent the previous year or so putting this film together, and I knew it was going to be several months before the film was going to be ready to be released.
Right.
And here the Pope was announcing that a year later the archives were going to be opened. So I spent the next day or two frantically calling up everybody who I had talked to for the film, including Suzanne, who's in the film. And she and a number of her colleagues and scholars who had been studying, and I basically needed their reassurances that the film wasn't going to be out of date even before it was released. And luckily, people like Suzanne and David Kurtzer and others who are in the film kind of calmed me down. They said, "Look, Steve, we're talking about 16, 17 million documents. It's going to take a long time to look through those archives." And of course, at the time, none of us knew that a year later, as Suzanne will tell us in a few minutes, the archives closed within days of their opening because of COVID, only to reopen some months later. So the bottom line is the timing was somewhat fortunate for me in the sense that my film did come out just as the topic of the Vatican and the Holocaust was kind of back in the news because of the opening of the archives, and so the timing worked out well. The significance of the name of the film. The title actually changed a little bit when I was first working on the film. My original working title, not too surprisingly, was Holy Secrets, simply because I knew that the archives covering Pius XII were still secret. But once again, Pope Francis kind of forced my hand on that one when he announced that the archives would be open. And I'm glad about that because the title of the film, what became the name of the film, Holy Silence, I actually think is a more it's a more accurate title for what the film is about, because ultimately this is a film about silence, what it means to be silent, what it means to be neutral at a time when the world was going through this very, very dark period in modern history. And those were the themes, I think, ultimately that the film was trying to explore. This notion of silence and neutrality. So I'm very grateful to Pope Francis for sort of inducing me to drop the name Secrets from the title and to go to silence. And finally, look, I hope that the themes that we're talking about tonight, some of the issues that are addressed in the film, and certainly some of the issues that all of us on this panel have been looking at, most of you have been looking at them far longer than I have. I think these are all themes and broad topics that not only have historians and scholars been grappling with for many decades, but we now know that these are issues that we're going to continue to be looking at for years to come, now that those archives are fully open to scholars and researchers.
Okay, thank you. So a lot to thank Pope Francis for. If I'm not mistaken, and Suzanne maybe can correct me on this, but I think he also announced that they were changing the name, that they didn't want to call it the Secret Archives anymore because it kind of had this ominous, kind of air to it. So,
yeah,
so maybe the secret part would have jived as well. What's that?
People picturing Tom Hanks sneaking his way.
Exactly. Exactly. Thank you so much for that. So my next question is for Phil. So Holy Silence notes that there was a long history of contemptuous Christian teachings about Jews and Judaism. Could you give us a kind of a brief overview of this teaching and how it set the backdrop for religious presuppositions of the main protagonists in the film?
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be with you this evening, particularly on Yom HaShoah. If Steve was concerned about answering his 4 questions briefly, you've asked me a question that spans 2,000 years, but I will do my best. So if we, as early as some passages that are found in the New Testament, there are texts where Jewish believers that Jesus had been raised from the dead criticized other Jews who did not share that belief or share that conviction. So for example, the evangelist Matthew polemicizes against other Jews who are not part of his Jewish believing in Jesus community. And so he accuses these other Jews, not in his group, of being responsible for the destruction of the temple in the year 70. Matthew writes around 85 or 90, and Jesus died around the year 30. So in those intervening decades, there have been tensions emerging within Judaism itself. And in Matthew chapter 27, he depicts crowds of Jews incited by the chief priests and elders, demanding that Jesus be crucified. And they exclaim, "His blood be on us and on our children." That, of course, is a, excuse me, I lost my screen for a second. That text written toward the end of the first century reflects this inner debate that's going on. Now, in the following centuries, when Gentile Christianity was becoming distinct from Rabbinic Judaism, emerging roughly the same time, Gentile Christians read passages such as Matthew's, not in their intramural context, but as outsiders looking inside, so to speak, at Judaism, and interpreted Matthew to be saying that all Jews were cursed by God for all time. And that's part of the seed for the teaching of contempt that pervaded in Christianity subsequently. The idea that Jews were Christ killers really pervaded the Christian world until the 20th century. So you'll notice, for example, in an illustration that will come up, that this is a medieval depiction from the 14th century showing a Jewish figure nailing Jesus to the cross. And you know he's Jewish because he's wearing the medieval hat that Jews were required to wear to identify themselves as Jews in Christian society. And the sentiment that is depicted here is can be summed up in a statement by Pope Innocent III, who in the year 1209 said the following: "Thus the Jews, against whom the blood of Jesus Christ calls out, although they ought not to be killed, lest Christian people forget the divine law, yet as wanderers ought they to remain upon the earth until their countenance be filled with shame, and they seek the name of Jesus Christ the Lord." End of quote. In other words, in medieval European Christendom, Jews were to be tolerated, but they were to be kept marginal and understood to be inferior because of their rejection of Christ. Now, leaping ahead to the 19th century, this religious antipathy became blended with a pseudo-scientific social Darwinism and mutated into racialist anti-Semitism. Jews were to be held in suspicion. They were to be considered other, not because of their distinctive beliefs and practices, but because of their genetic structure. By the early 20th century, for example, Catholic theologians, I'll reflect my own tradition in this, Catholic theologians such as a Jesuit named George Bilkmer could write about a second Jewish original sin, quote unquote, that the waters of baptism did not remedy. He wrote, quote, "This restless and aimless people does not possess sufficient salvific powers of grace in order to counteract its defective genetic material or to properly develop its valuable genetic material," end quote. This, of course, is heretical, but the notion that baptism doesn't cleanse sin and so forth. But this was quite an attractive theory in this time period among many Christians in Europe. As John Connolly, in a very important recent book, has shown, even two anti-Nazi Catholics who later became champions of rapprochement with Jews, I'm thinking of John Osterreicher and Karl Thieme, they for a time before the war and maybe at the beginning of the Second World War, harbored the thought that the Nazi persecution of Jews might be an apocalyptic moment, and that would finally induce the Jews to turn to Christ and thus escape their accursed condition. So the point of all of this, having run through those 20 centuries, is to say that the theme of Jews as divinely cursed was so pervasive in Christian and later in Western secular culture that when the Nazi genocide began, to quote a Vatican document, the spiritual resistance and concrete action of Christians was not that which might have been expected from Christ's followers, end quote. Christian theologians, preachers, and teachers were all too easily co-opted by Nazi racism, anti-Semitism, because Jews had been othered for so long in Christian society. And this is the Catholic ethos in which Popes Pius XI and Pius XII were formed and raised as Catholics and as clergy, and in which their papacies unfolded. Main subject of Steve's film. Right. Jews were under the wrath of God, and so it was to be expected that they were fated to suffer misfortune or even worse.
Right. Thank you. That is a very able and whirlwind tour through 2,000 years of history, which is exceptionally helpful in understanding the background for the film. And then also, I think an important point you make, and we may get to this question at some point in the panel, is this distinction between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, which you referenced in your comments. And so we may have an opportunity to dive more into that. So that's excellent. Thank you so much. So that 2,000 whirlwind tour through history, right up to Pope Pius XI and the 12th. And so now I'd like to turn to a discussion towards specifically Pope Pius XII and his legacy. So to get us started, we're just going to listen to a clip that features historian Robert Ventresca. And then after we all watch that clip together, I'm going to pose a question to Adam. So roll clip.
We've just learned so much more about what was actually said, not said, what was actually done or not done. And I hope that we can finally come away from these really simplistic caricatures, either that he's Hitler's Pope or he's a righteous Gentile. So it's important not to demonize him. But I think, canonizing him literally or figuratively is another matter as well.
So thank you. So my question then here is for Adam. So in light of the clip that we just watched, speaking from the perspective of a scholar of Jewish-Christian relations, could you suggest how we might go about evaluating the actions of the Pope and other top Vatican officials during the Nazi period? And then second, how might this affect Jewish-Christian relations even today?
Yeah, hi.
Hi, Adam.
On the one hand, it's tragic to realize the effect of this centuries-old tradition of Christian anti-Judaism had on church views and actions during the Shoah. That history, as Phil really ably discussed, is immediately relevant to understanding the church during the Shoah. Scholars, I think, have reasonably said that this Christian tradition of anti-Judaism was a necessary, if not sufficient, condition for the occurrence of the Shoah, this horrific event in the center of Europe, long been a Christian, region
Right.
in some sense. On the other hand, when we discuss contemporary Jewish-Christian relations, Christian history, and even the church's actions during the war, that's relevant, but it's not the whole story. In particular, the contemporary Catholic Church, that is after the Shoah, after the Second Vatican Council in the 60s, is remarkably different from the earlier church, and that distinction shouldn't be blurred. Without exculpating Pius or anyone else, honesty demands that we recognize the nearly complete rejection of past anti-Jewish teachings in the church. And this is an ongoing and theologically challenging endeavor for Catholics, certainly, but for Christians in general. To make such a change, I mean, it requires, requires sort of wrestling with, the theological implications of reevaluating their theological views about Jews and Judaism, and we've seen this in statements like those issued by the Catholic Church and the Second Vatican Council, later Catholic statements, and also Western Protestant churches. They've all deeply reconsidered what they teach and say about Jews and Judaism, and really, to their credit, breaking with the hostile view of Jews as cast off by God and murderers of Jesus. Now, these in turn have prompted profound questions about Christian faith. In sort of making a shift in that way in their views of Jews and Judaism, raises questions about, for example, the universality of salvation in Christ.
Right.
It raises questions about mission and conversion, both generally, but also, of course, to Jews specifically. There's also a broader lesson of avoiding generalizations about Jewish-Christian relations, and even about Catholic teachings, Catholicism, Christianity. Of course, there have been these major developments, and the focus on Pius XII is important, but I would say I don't want to focus over much on Pius XII, as scholars will tell you, is a much broader and more complex history. There's more multifaceted history, and I think that's important to keep in mind. I would say, especially among Jews, we need to be careful not to, so to speak, bear false witness about others, and continue to speak as if nothing has changed. I mean, as if the church of today is a little different from the church of the past. No, that's not true, and I'm quite thankful for that.
Thank you. Thank you for that very thoughtful answer. And I think it's a good reminder of the fact that we are scratching the surface in some ways in talking about many of these issues. It's a very complex history. And I really think that the documentary in this panel really gives us a way in and trying to understand some of that complexity. So thank you. So Susanna, actually, I'm going to turn to you, Suzanne. So I understand that you were excited about taking a deep dive into the archives late last winter, and then the pandemic hit. But you were able to spend some time, about a week, in the Vatican Apostolic Archive last year. And then based on a conversation we had earlier, you may actually be able to go back now if the stars align. You actually maybe you'll go back to the Vatican Archives in June.
Yeah.
So from your perspective as a historian and knowing the volume of documents that have been released, could you comment on the process of archival research and the questions of when is it too soon to really render an opinion or a verdict on such contended questions like the ones about the historical and the political and the moral questions that surround the Vatican and the Holocaust?
Yeah. Well, I'll take a step back to try to describe a little bit what we're talking about when we talk about the Vatican Archives. It's collectively, it's everything for the pontificate of Pius XII. So this would cover the years of 1939 to 1958. And rather than just sitting in one archive, the formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, they actually sit in 6 larger archives, I would say, and then dozens of smaller ones all across Vatican City and Rome. And it's it's a bit of a researcher's nightmare in the sense of each of these archives has a different director and a different prefect and a different system for registering, different hours, different security measures, different requirements. So Rome is a lovely city and an expensive one for scholars. So it's just even the process of getting yourself there and getting literally into the archive is its own kind of experience. In March of 2020, the museum's very interested in these archives, and we're hoping to work as we did a few decades ago to obtain partial copies in Washington for those who can't get all the way to Rome. So we were just super excited to be there on day one, and there was this crowd of researchers outside of St. Anna's Gate where you have to go through to get to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. from Rome and Germany and France and all over the world. And the pandemic hit, and I, as a federal employee, had to return before I could step in, and the others did go for 4 days, and then somebody in the Secretary of State got COVID, and everything closed down. So it was just, after waiting, since 1945, and then to have them open 4 days, we were all just pretty devastated, I have to say. But yes, I was fortunate. The museum was able to reopen for a month last October, and of course that was the first thing on our agenda. So I had been working in copies of the archives that we have at the museum and diocesan archives in Washington for my whole career. I had never researched in Rome, so this was like crazy exciting for me.
Right.
Also as a Catholic, to just be there in St. Peter's Square, because the archive is literally next to St. Peter's Square, and you have to go through Swiss guards, several layers of it. It's just very fancy.
Of 2019, and you have to cover your shoulders, right?
But yes,
right. And so I'm like taking it off, putting it on, taking it off. And then when we finally got to the archives, I had to keep it on. But
I was just blown away, and I got through all the layers to get to the study room, and even that was just, rather than sitting in dusty shelves, there are marble statues of Mary, and gorgeous, thousands of years old paintings, and it was amazing. And having researchers next to me looking at manuscripts from 12th and 13th centuries. So it was just, so my researcher nerd self was just completely geeking out. And then there's the matter of, okay, which of these 16 million plus pages do I look at first? And so I had a very short time there, and I actually did discover 2 really interesting documents just in that 1 week, which tells us that how much there probably will be to know. One was from a woman a German Catholic woman who wrote a letter in 1945 to Pius XII, just ripping him apart for remaining silent. She did use the word silent in this letter in 1945, really critiquing Pius XII and the German bishops, and cataloging everything that had happened since 1930. And I was just really amazed, because the issues Steve raises in the film and we're wrestling with today in Catholic and Jewish communities and all over the world, she laid them out in 1945 in this letter it was amazing. Another discovery that was really interesting to me was a war criminal named Oswald Pohl, who was in charge of the slave labor system, the whole concentration camp universe in Germany. He was convicted to be executed by the Allies in 1947, and had a conversion experience in church, not in church, in jail. He was in one of the Allied prisons, and converted to Catholicism, and according to his confessor at the prison, atoned for his sins, and it was a sincere conversion. And he requested from Pius XII what's called in Catholic tradition a pardon at the hour of death, and he received it. He received a telegram from Pius XII giving him this pardon at the hour of death. And this leaked to the media, who people had opinions about that decision. And it was really interesting, because I got to see the internal discussion between the nuncio in Germany, the papal diplomat, and the second highest person in the Vatican, who later became Pope himself, Giovanni Battista Montini, on whether it was the right thing to do or not. So just even in that 1 week. And so to your final question of when is too soon?
When is too soon, right?
Well, look, 16 million pages, dozens of languages, multiple archives. I'd say we're going to be at this for a couple of decades. And I think we're going to see lots of fascinating discoveries. We've already seen some fascinating work from David Kurtzer on the Finale boys. And we just have to take each piece with a grain of salt and look at what the evidence says, and be open and honest to what it says, and just keep building that picture piece by piece. And it'll take time.
It'll take time. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I was telling my students the other day, we also have to be careful about telling what we call these Whiggish histories, right? Where we're judging the past based on the present, and doing that kind of archival research really grounds us as to what's going on at the time and helping us understand that. So thank you. So I'm now going to turn back to Steve. So could you share with us a little bit more about your filmmaking and research process and what led to your interest, in this topic in the first place?
Sure. Well, I'll answer your second question first.
Sure.
You had mentioned in the introductions, Kate, I had made a previous film, a film called 50 Children. That film was about an American couple who had rescued a group of Jewish children on the eve of the Holocaust in 1939. And in the course of making that film, I became more and more fascinated, not just, of course, with the broader topic of the Holocaust, but in particular with sort of finding American perspectives on that period of history.
Mm-hmm.
That particular film ended up being as much, if not more, about what was happening in our country, in the United States, vis-a-vis whether or not Jewish refugees, including children, were going to be allowed into this country.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I had finished that film and was casting about for another film, I had become just generally aware of some of the issues that were surrounding the Vatican, including, of course, this ongoing debate at the time over the legacy of Pius XII in particular.
Mm-hmm.
But really what kind of sealed the deal for me in terms of making the decision to make this film was when I was doing some initial research and came upon the story of Father John Lafarge,
Mm-hmm.
who had nothing to do particularly with Pius XII, but Father Lafarge, who was a Jesuit priest from New England, had been called upon by Pius XI to help draft what became known as the Hidden Encyclical, which is part of the focus of Holy Silence.
Right.
And as I did with my 50 Children film, I was just so intrigued by looking at some American figures, people like Father Lafarge, people like Myron Taylor, who was President Roosevelt's personal envoy to the Vatican. And I decided that that would be sort of the part of the focus of the film. Here's a photograph of
Lafarge,
Father Lafarge. And so that really, more than anything else, was what sort of got me intrigued about making the film, looking at some of these American officials. In terms of the filmmaking process and the research, I guess there are sort of two parts to it as a filmmaker. The sort of easy part is reading up on the topic and then basically calling the scholars, people like Suzanne, people like David Kurtzer, people like Robert Ventresca, the ones who know this subject backwards and forwards, and basically asking if it would be okay if I showed up with my cameraman, as you'll see in this photograph right here, where we filmed Professor Ventresca up in Canada, and just getting them to talk about about this topic. That's the fun part. But of course, film is a visual medium, and you don't want just a bunch of people talking. It has to be a little more visually entertaining than that. So the other fun part, of course, is doing the research and defining the visual elements. So old newsreel footage, finding, and I was fortunate to find some fascinating old pieces of newsreel footage that included glimpses of Pius XII talking to American soldiers after the Allies had liberated Rome and had an audience with the Pope. So, visual ways of telling these stories, which is also sort of the fun part of the research for me as the filmmaker, all of which ends up going into the mix when you put together a film like this.
Very good. I can imagine there was also maybe a killing your darlings moment where you're editing and you're like, oh, I don't want to let that go.
Well, as a matter of fact, Kate, yes, and probably just very briefly,
Yeah.
probably because I mentioned my interest in telling sort of American stories or casting a spotlight on some American officials. There was an American official, Father Joseph Patrick Hurley, who was a long-standing member of the Vatican sort of diplomatic corps. Fascinating guy. Great story. My friend, Father Charles Gallagher, who's in the film, had written a terrific book about Father Hurley, and an early version of the film had Father Hurley in the film. And then, as my film editor and I were putting the finishing touches on the film, you have to let certain things go, and so for a variety of reasons, Father Hurley wound up on the cutting room floor. But there you have it.
But he's immortalized in this.
Absolutely.
So thank you. That's helpful. And so yeah, and it's also phenomenal. You mentioned that there's a lot of books, a lot of literature about it, but very few films or specifically documentaries. So truly, for those of you who are watching, this is truly quite a find for us. And thank you so much for making this film. And so let's go back to that, shall we? Let's go back to looking at a clip of your film. And so we're going to look at next a longer clip, which juxtaposes statements from Father Hoffman of the Vatican, a nun, an Italian Jew, and historian Dr. Suzanne Zuccotti.
Pius XII did a lot for the Pius XII did a lot for the Jewish people, but behind the scenes. What he could do, he did. But he had to be cautious. It's a fact that during World War II, during the occupation here in Rome, a lot of Jewish people were saved and rescued. They were hidden in convents, in monasteries, even the Vatican. The Pope is the head of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church. The priests and nuns wouldn't have done that without the approval of Pius XII.
Durante il periodo della guerra, le suore, e dietro il consiglio e non in posizione da parte del Santo Padre Pio XII, hanno aperto anche loro le porte, perché volevano veramente condividere il desiderio del Santo Padre, che ha fatto tanto per salvare questi nostri fratelli.
My grandfather didn't get this invitation. Most of the Roman Jews had to find their ways, and they could have been warned. That would have been enough, trust me. This would have been enough. My grandfather, who had at that time 3 children, they went to hide in a carpenter factory where my grandfather's brother had a job. The boss of this place was not Jewish, let them stay. My great-grandmother, she was arrested in May 44, so she basically left Rome, I think with the last train that ever arrived in Poland. And then when she arrived in Auschwitz, she was immediately gassed.
Gli SS sono entrati nel monastero e volevano perquisire il monastero. Che quanto è entrato questi SS, perché volevano portare via gli ebrei nascosti, c'era una superiora molto energica e di fronte a questa affermazione lei ha avuto il coraggio, disinvolta, lasciando così come se niente fosse, i nostri fratelli ebrei sono stati salvati.
The story of Jews hiding in monasteries and convents and Catholic schools and Catholic hospitals is a very complicated one. There's been very little evidence of a papal role in the opening of these institutions. They were aware, and absolutely no question, that the Pope had called for the need for compassion for the victims of war, but he had not directed institutions to open their doors.
So another powerful clip. And so I apologize in advance, Suzanne. I'm about to ask you a very unfair question that you should never ask an historian, which is I'm going to ask you to make a prediction, because typically, historians about documenting the past, not about, kind of foreseeing the future. But I'm wondering if you think the archives might shed some light on this very contested question of whether Pope Pius XII especially directed religious communities, nuns, priests to hide Jews. So that goes to the point that was made a little bit in the clip. And then second, do you think we will learn more about individual Catholics who saved Jews, and if they were acting on their own or if they were acting in response to some kind of papal directive?
It's one of the key questions about the Holocaust, really, human choice, and why do we make the choices we did, and did those Catholics in Rome who rescued think they were doing so at the behest of the Pope? I have to agree with Professor Zuccotti that it's a really complicated issue. Now, hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews were hidden on Vatican property. Would the Pope have known about this? Of course. Father Hoffman is right. Something like that would have been something the Pope was aware of. But did he specifically give a directive for it, or did he quietly say nothing when, we have to think of how chaotic it was. These were desperate knocks on the door of convents and homes all over Rome, and decisions had to be made, on the spot. And most likely, different convents and institutions made different decisions and informed the Pope later. He would have heard about it, but potentially much later. I think we will find the answer as we start going through these records. I'm not sure we'll find them in the diplomatic papers. I think we'll find them in memoirs and contemporary diaries, perhaps in some of the smaller archives of the institutions that hid themselves, and small convents and schools and monasteries. That's where we're going to find the answers. For understandable reasons, I think we've all been very fixated on what did Pope Pius XII say and do. And it's the right question, in the sense that he's the leader of the Universal Catholic Church with billions of followers, and sits on the throne of St. Peter. But I think that individual agency, I think individuals, because of the chaos of the moment, had some room to make a decision on their own, and many of them did. And I think 5 years, 10 years from now, we're going to know much more about whether there was a specific written directive or not.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. Not only did you give us a prediction, you predicted where we might find that information. So thank you very much for doubling down on my question. And so you mentioned, and this is my question for Adam now, is that you mentioned about this kind of desire to know what Pope Pius XII did and didn't do, or what he knew and didn't know. And so my question for Adam, for you, is that, of course, the documentary is part of this larger body of research that gets to this very question. And so in the film, Professor Gotti and Thayer remark on Pius's the 1942 Christmas message. And when Pius said, quote, "Hundreds of thousands of persons, and with no fault on their part, sometimes only because of their nationality or race, have been consigned to death or to a slow decline," end quote. So this is from Pope Pius's 1942 Christmas message. So would, say, Jesuit Father Lafarge's unpublished encyclical for Pius XII, so Lafarge, you may remember, was that image we saw earlier, do you think it would have had any effect? And then what if Pius XII had been, direct in his 42 message, and if he had used the word Jews and anti-Semitism instead of these kind of oblique, kind of shrouded references to like nationality and race?
Yeah, so there are a couple of issues at stake here. Perhaps that could be said for all of our answers.
Sure.
But there are a couple of issues at stake here, and I guess I would sort of lay them out this way. So the actual effect of a different, more outspoken policy by Pius or by the church is impossible to know, right? So, I could speculate. I don't think different words would have made much of a difference.
Okay.
there really wasn't any mystery about who the Nazis' victims. The how does it? The main victims. I don't want to slight other communities. But sort of, the prominent focus of Nazi genocidal activity. And so, I mean, anything short of the Pope saying something like, I insist that Catholics resist, it would seem to me to be likely to be unhelpful, let alone the sort of, kind of ambiguous type statement. So that's the actual effect question. For later assessments of the church's behavior, especially assessing it in moral terms, these policies and these statements, or failure to make statements, they do matter. It would surely have been meaningful to have at least seen such an outspoken statement, or heard such an outspoken statement, for what it would reflect regarding the church's attitudes towards the Shoah. Its actual effect is unknown, but I imagine its effect on the subsequent Jewish Christian history would have been quite significant. We do get a sense of one prominent perspective in the Lafarge encyclical, Humani Generis Unitas. Now, it wasn't issued, but I think it helps us assess the mindset and sort of behavior better. It certainly had positive aspects in it, in its denunciations of Nazism, and Stephen notes this in the movie. But the church was kind of stuck in a problem of its own making. Right? So they're trying to reject secular anti-Semitism, that is Nazism, while defending traditional anti-Judaism, that long history that Phil went over. And so the encyclical still talks of Jews as Christ killers, as justly suffering dispersion and powerlessness, right? This is the 1930s. It's uncomfortably close to Nazi ideas. At least in concern, for example, Jews in broader society, in Christian society. I'll just give you one example. So at one point, the document reads, quote, this Nazi campaign against the Jews has at least this advantage, that it recalls the true nature, the authentic basis of the social separation of the Jews from the rest of humanity, end quote. Now, so you have this effort to, on the one hand, denounce, on the other hand, uphold this tradition. And so, in light of this confusion and ambiguity, I suspect, even had that same been issued, it wouldn't have accomplished very much. And for this point, I feel I should give credit to Phil. We've spoken about this before. It might have actually, kind of fixed the church in some ways, or committed it to some noxious, theologically noxious views had it been issued. And so is it a good thing that it wasn't? It's hard to say. I mean, looking back, I think the never issued encyclical does give us some insight into the influences on the popes and the church's thinking. It was not written by him. It was written by these other figures. They're largely disheartening, sort of what we learned from it. And they don't suggest kind of give any evidence of the type of changes that they're going to really have to undergo in the wake of the Shoah. This is very much a pre-World War II and in many ways pre-Vatican II document. If anything, perhaps to end on a better note, on a more uplifting, I mean, if anything, it's kind of the distance that the church has gone from a document like that. I mean, it kind of reveals the profundity and significance of post-Shoah changes.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your response there. And you mentioned Phil and the 2,000-year whirlwind history that we went through, and so that's who we'll return to, actually. So that's a great segue, Adam. So my next question is for Phil, and this will be for our audience. This will be our last question before turning to the Q&A. So again, as a reminder, please pop them into the Q&A into the chat for our co-host Julia Ladine, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. So, Phil, moving from the 1940s to the 1960s and the present, earlier you mentioned this idea of Jews as accursed Christ killers, right? Which Adam also mentioned earlier, and that has a long history in Christianity. So, could you say a bit more about this and what had to change in order for a document like Nostra Aetate to be issued in '65? And you may want to just kind of give people a sense of what Nostra Aetate is, and then what you think had to change in order for a document like that to actually to be conceived and promulgated.
Sure. I'm happy to speak in terms of decades and not millennia. Let me pick up where Adam left off in a way. I want to stress, as I suggested earlier, that Catholic and other Christian theologians were really in a straitjacket theologically when it came to considering Jews and Judaism. And this was true after the Second World War for some time as well. Jews were, of course, understood to be entitled to basic human rights, but nonetheless, the Christian presupposition that was yet uncritiqued was that the hand of God sort of weighed heavily upon Jews. The film shows this very clearly, and also, I think, nicely paints the different personalities of Pius XI and Pius XII. Akil Ratti, Pius XI, he seemed more ready to challenge anti-Semitic rhetoric in draft documents that came before him. There's some evidence of this. Whereas Eugenio Pacelli, Pius XII, didn't seem to have that same sensitivity. So as the film indicated, Pius XI invited John Lafarge and a couple of other Jesuits to draft an encyclical called Humani Generis Unitas. It was never issued. There's a story there we won't get into about whether even Pius XI read it or not, read the draft. He was very ill in the last few months of his life, and then he died. And the encyclical project more or less died with him. So getting back to this notion of a theological straitjacket, until this notion that Jews were under a curse by God was critiqued and was rejected, the efforts of Catholic and other Christian anti-Nazi efforts was futile. Their presuppositions sort of eviscerated any attempts that they could make to condemn the Nazis, who were, after all, doing some of the things that popes and leaders of Christian communities had been saying for centuries. So the key was, the change that occurred, and I'm indebted again to John Connolly for this, was that the Shoah triggered a rereading of a very important New Testament text, Romans chapter 11. And in particular, that when Paul wrote in that chapter, quote, all Israel will be saved, end quote, he actually meant Jews, that Jews were Israel. And it wasn't the church as the new Israel that was entirely to be saved. It was Jews, and also that they were beloved of God. And these two passages and a few others from Romans figured very prominently when Nostra Aetate, a document of the Second Vatican Council issued in 1965, was issued. It drew on Romans 11, and it drew on it read in this new way and understood. Almost everybody agrees now the way Paul meant it to be understood. And I can demonstrate this really quickly with two pairs of quotes. So Humani Generis Unitas had been, again, a draft that was never promulgated, said, quote, misguided Jewish leaders had called down upon their own heads a divine malediction, and so were doomed, as it were, to perpetually wander over the face of the earth. On the other hand, Nostra Aetate, 25 or so years later, says, quote, Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God as if this followed from Holy Scripture, end quote. Well, that's exactly opposite. Right? These are diametrically opposed sentiments. Another pair, again, Humani Generis Unitas, that never promulgated draft encyclical, quote, well, the church has always had to, quote, safeguard her children against spiritual contagion, end quote, by contact with Jews. Nostra Aetate, 25 or so years later, the Sacred Synod, quote, wants to foster and recommend that mutual understanding and respect, which is the fruit, above all, of biblical and theological studies, as well as of fraternal dialogues, end quote. So from a posture where Catholics were urged not to have any conversation with Jews because they might be led astray,
Right.
now the church is saying, we should dialogue, we should talk, there should be collaboration and joint study. And every single Vatican document since Nostra Aetate that bears on relations with Jews has repeated, we're in the dialogue business. This is what we want to do. We want to understand each other. We want to learn from one another. It's the reason really why Adam and I work together at St. Joseph's. It's because of this document from the Second Vatican Council. So let me wrap this up by simply saying, I think Adam was a little more circumspect, but for what it's worth, I think that if Humani Generis Unitas had been promulgated by either Pius XI or Pius XII in anything resembling the form of the draft that we have, and that's a big if, I presume, but had that happened, I don't think Nostra Aetate could possibly have been issued. And the reason why would be because it would be fresh in people's living memory that a pope in an encyclical had said Jews were cursed by God, and you could not reverse that drastically as Nostra Aetate actually did. The text of either Pius XI or Pius XII would still have been too fresh in people's minds.
Oh, gotcha. Right, and that's a really helpful contrast too between the one that was ever promulgated and the one that is, because it truly underscores that ecumenical kind of bend of Nostra Aetate that's obvious, but is even more obvious when it's juxtaposed against the one that was never.
And there's, you could do many more such contrasts.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you. So that actually ends our conversation so far as my asking questions of our panelists, and we're now turning it to our Q&A. So let's go to our audience to see if there's some submitted questions, and we'll probably have about 15 or so minutes in order to discuss further with our illustrious panel. So let's see. So for our first question, and I mentioned this before as while we're waiting for some Q&A to come in, is I mentioned earlier this distinction between anti-Judaism and an anti-Semitism. So perhaps either maybe Phil or Adam could speak to this distinction, maybe just a little more.
Sure. I guess since Phil just had the last word, I'll just jump in, and Phil, please join me if you'd like. So I would emphasize I think, shift away from that distinction. More recently. It's been, it's very tidy. Let me just be clear. So you've got theological anti-Judaism, which is largely grounded in religious claims that go back to the early centuries of Christian separation from Judaism, so to speak. And then you have Nazi anti-Semitism, which, they're perhaps, sort of references to Christian teaching, but it's largely kind of secular project, for lack of a better word. And it's been kind of tidy to separate the two. If anything, it almost works kind of chronologically as well. It's kind of like the 19th century came in, anti-Semitism came in, and using the term like anti-Semitism in contrast to anti-Judaism, it's almost like you're comparing two very different things. That distinction has rightfully, I think, taken a hit. Phil, spoke, for example, about the way in which, the simplest example is Catholic religious thinkers adopting what we would consider to be racist categories and concepts. And so, for example, the notion that baptism doesn't work on the Jewish convert is practically heretical. Or heretical. Far be it from me to be, sitting in judgment of Catholic theology. But really, that's a crazy idea. And so it reflects, I think, the way in which racial hatred infused, unfortunately, some of the sort of these theological thinkers. I will confess that I still kind of make the distinction sometimes when I'm teaching. It's kind of overly tidy, but it's not entirely accurate.
Okay. Thank you.
Let me jump in for just 60 seconds on this. I think about this a lot, and there is this kind of academic debate about the distinction between the two, and church officials like the distinction between the two because it's a way to separate themselves from the worst outcome of anti-Jewish sentiment, which is death and murder.
Right.
My
And
answer to this when
I
I'm
remember the Shoah, I think that document also reflects that distinction. Is that
yes, you're right. Yeah,
that's
it
an example,
does.
I think, of what Suzanne is saying. Yeah.
And I always come back to if I am a Jewish mother in 1941 and I am watching somebody rip my child out of my arms, I'm not wondering, do they hate me because of my religion or do they hate me because of my race? The impact of both is the same. It comes to the same endpoint, and I feel for victims of those sentiments, however you want to label them, the outcome is the same, and I find that useful to think about it that way.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's good to get some different perspectives on this. And while I actually have you, let me ask you another quick question, which is so we don't talk as much in the film about what happens after the war. And so could you comment on the stories about the Vatican helping Nazi war criminals after the war to escape to other parts of the world, like for instance, South America?
Well, this is one of the big mysteries we're hoping to solve in the newly opened archives. Historians have known for a long time, even as it was happening, that four houses in particular in Rome were part of a network to help war criminals escape through Rome to Latin America. The German church, the Croatian church, the Austrian church, and I'm forgetting the fourth, were very active in letting war criminals come through and then escape to South America. And we knew this. Alois Hudal was the name of the rector of the college that was helpful for Austrian and German escapees. What we don't know and what we're going to find out is to what extent did these activities, to what extent were they discussed at the highest levels? We know that they were discussed because at some point these houses were shut down in 1950. Montini, second in command at the time, he must have known about this. Did he discuss this with Pius XII? Right. What did they say? They must have known it was going on. Why did they stop it or not? And there's the American factor in there because the Americans were working with the Vatican to recruit some of these war criminals as spies. So these are webs we have to untangle. It's one of the big unanswered questions for us.
Gotcha. Thank you. It's helpful. Yeah. So, and I know this is one of the questions that my students often ask. And so thank you. So I'm going to go back to you, Steve. So in the film, there's an image that's seen to be an excerpt from an encyclical. Was that an actual excerpt or a paraphrasing of what was assumed to be in the encyclical? And if it was actually part of the encyclical, where did you locate this excerpt and how much of it actually exists in some form where others can access it?
Yeah, an English language draft of what Father Lafarge had been working on with his two Jesuit colleagues, along with a French draft, have been out there for many, many years now. So the image that is seen in the film is a recreated but accurate reference to part of Father Lafarge's English language draft. So the words that are seen on the camera, the words rather that are seen in the film, are the words that were reflected in part of Father Lafarge's draft of that encyclical. The document itself was not something that I had at my disposal, but anybody can do a Google search for the hidden encyclical, and you'll see plenty of references to the entire text. It's all readily available online.
Okay, thank you. So Phil, I'm going to turn to you. So in talking about this shift in teachings, and for instance, we talked about the, encyclical, if you wish, that never was circulated, and then the one that was later. So in these, as teachings have changed, and as teachings have changed specifically regarding Jews and Judaism, how do you think this is translated to like the pew and the pulpit, right? So you have these teachings, at the highest level with the Vatican, and how do you think that's actually translating, if that's something you think you can speculate about?
Yes, and let me answer that by sort of getting back to the anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism distinction,
Okay.
In a kind of strange way, perhaps.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why that distinction is helpful is at least it identifies sort of the thought history of animus against Jews, and if it is emerging from religious ideas. Such as the Christ killer charge, right? God is mad at Jews, killing Christ, etc. One can identify that, and then religious teachings can change that. If the religious teachings change, that can be gotten at, and I'll say something about that in direct answer to your question.
Okay.
But what happened historically was that sort of othering of Jews in Christian society got embedded in the culture of Europe and mutated, I used that word in a different sense earlier, but adapted to the rise of secularity, right? So now the reason for othering Jews is because there's something wrong physically with them that even religious rituals cannot address.
Right.
And so in a sense, what Christianity did, this is oversimplifying like everything else, what Christianity in a sense did was it helped to create a monster that then it couldn't control when it no longer had the power that it had in medieval Christendom.
Okay.
And how do you put the genie back in the bottle once it's now not religiously based, right? So having said that, let me just say that there's a couple of ways to measure the effect of Nostra Aetate, the Vatican II document that reversed earlier attitudes.
Right.
My doctoral dissertation was a study of every Catholic religion textbook in the United States in 1990, which was 1,800 lessons in grammar and high school textbooks and their teachers' manuals.
Right.
And there was an earlier study in 1975 that was quite similar. And there was another study in 1959, so before Vatican II, not exactly the same kind of analysis, but enough to give us the comparative base.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that all of, let me just call it the gross stuff, Pilate wanted to save Jesus, but the bloodthirsty Jews demanded his death, which was in a second grade textbook, by the way, in the late 1950s.
Did you say second grade?
I did. That is entirely gone. I mean, you just cannot find that kind of stuff anymore in American religion textbooks. And, I haven't studied every other country. Certainly true in many countries, although there are some issues. I don't want to whitewash that everything is all cleaned up. But nonetheless, there's a radical change. Now that has an effect, right? But it's not the cure-all, it's not the panacea, although it's a good start, because then how would you account for the fact that a couple of years ago, there was a newspaper story in the Boston Globe that there was a Catholic high school basketball game in competition with a public high school that was largely Jewish, and the Catholic crowd, fans of the team, yelled out, "You killed Jesus," to the opposing team.
Right.
Which to me is horrifying because, they didn't pick that up from their religion lessons per se, but they picked it up from the culture.
Right.
And so there's still a lot that has to be done. There's a lot that has to be done in terms of preaching and the way the gospel readings about Jesus arguing with Jewish contemporaries, how that is handled. So there's been a lot of progress, but there's a lot left to do. And and again, the rest of the world has its own particular histories in each context.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And it's really great because it really shows that the film in its own right is so great for documenting what happened. But then, of course, it's always great to then use that as a way of understanding what's going on now, and which you did by citing that, that particular incident. So we're going to save the last question this evening for the filmmaker himself, which is this. We all had the great opportunity that registered for this to be able to see the film. But a lot of people are wondering, when would this film be open to the public? Because a lot of us really, interested in our classes, and we want to do, other things. And so my understanding is that there are some places now where people might be able to go to see it. So could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure, absolutely, Kate.
All our thoughts on it.
No, the film is easily available. It's been showing on PBS since November, and so people can find it through PBS. There's something called PBS Passport, which is the PBS streaming service. It's available there, and it's also available on Amazon Prime. So it's readily available, and I encourage people to watch.
Yes, please do. So for those of you who've been asking, there you go. You've heard it from the director's lips himself, right? So PBS Passport or Amazon Prime. So please do share it. So that concludes our very lively and stimulating discussion. I cannot thank you enough for your time this evening, and I cannot thank our audience enough for attending. So at this point, I'm actually going to turn it over to Rebecca for our closing remarks. Thank you.
So thank you for joining us for tonight's program. With the Vatican Archives for this 1939 to 58 period now open, so many questions await rigorous scholarly analysis, as we've heard tonight. And I just want to re-emphasize yet again that none of us in this field expect quick answers. It will take many years and many, many scholars from different countries and different areas of specialization to carefully examine this material. And the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum is excited to lead some of these efforts. I want to say a word about the museum's programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust, which has been an integral part of the museum since its founding. We foster scholarship, teaching, and reflection on the profound ethical, theological, and historical questions raised by the Holocaust. We work with scholars, religious leaders, interreligious groups, and people of all faiths who are interested in the history of the Church's responses to the Holocaust and the ways in which religious institutions and leaders and theologians have addressed this history since 1945. So through discussions with filmmakers, theologians, and historians like we've done tonight, we are able to highlight the latest research and learn more about Holocaust history and the role of the Catholic Church during this period. As we close, I just want to highlight two upcoming programs that are currently open for applications that we are organizing. The first is our annual faculty seminar. This year is entitled The Holocaust and the Christian Tradition in Seminary Education Today. And this is aimed primarily at faculty teaching in seminaries. The URL there, ushmm.org/per, and you can find the information. Applications are due April 15th. And the second event is a virtual workshop that we are co-hosting with Boston College and Yad Vashem on some of this brand new research that is being done as we speak in the Vatican Archives. And it is entitled Archives, Power, and Truth-Telling, Catholic Archives and the Holocaust. We're very excited about this program. And so if you or other colleagues or people you know work on these topics, they are invited to submit applications. And again, you can find more information at ushmm.org/per. Thank you for tuning in tonight and have a great evening.